Each year, Microsoft Research hosts hundreds of influential speakers from around the world, including leading scientists, renowned experts in technology, book authors, and leading academics, and makes videos of these lectures freely available.
I'm pleased to introduce Rich Caruana from Microsoft as our first speaker. Rich got his PhD from Carnegie Mellon, and unfortunately didn't have the displeasure to take my class because he graduated a little before I joined. One distinguishing feature about Rich is that he needs to update his webpage because he still hasn't created a new one, I guess. But he was a professor at Cornell for quite a while before joining Microsoft, and over the years he's done some tremendous work in all areas of machine learning. In fact, very well known for a number of different techniques and taking those techniques into practice, which is, I think, what we're going to hear about today.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction. So, hi, I'm Rich Caruana. I'm one of the brilliant Microsoft research engineers. And I've already started on the beer, so I have a head start on all of you. So although I'm probably best known for my work in supervised learning, I thought it'd be fun to talk about clustering, and in particular, the problem of clustering. Before I start, this is a project I've been doing for a while. Let me just cite my collaborators. So back at Just Research in the late 90s, David Cohn and Andrew McCallum, some of you may recognize those names. And then grad students at CMU that I worked with, and then grad students at Cornell. And some of this work was funded by the NSF. Okay, so let's quickly compare supervised learning and unsupervised learning. So supervised learning, you have these really nice supervisory labels, right? So we know it's class 0 or 1, or multiple classes, or we have regression targets. You know, in clustering, we really don't have labels. We just sort of have data. So we're missing something that we have in supervised learning. Supervised learning, we have these crisp performance criteria. We have accuracy, area under the RC curve, log loss, things like that. Clustering, we kind of have compactness in some often undefined metric space. So again, unsupervised clustering is sort of at a disadvantage here. You know, in supervised learning, we have pretty well-defined goals, which is why we cast it as an optimization process. You know, it's minimized loss. Now, the one thing that makes supervised learning difficult is that it's minimized loss on a test set, not on the training set. So that's where a lot of the interesting stuff happens in supervised learning. In unsupervised learning, the goals are more vague. You know, we want to sort of find groups of similar items. And that's sort of all we're told to do. And then, you know, in clustering, you know, this very underspecified problem, we're sort of expected to do clustering in a way that's going to be useful to the task at hand, and we haven't even defined the task at hand, and we don't have labels and crisp criteria and things like that. So I guess I would argue that in some ways supervised learning is a lot easier than unsupervised learning. So let's talk a little bit more about this. Now, I'm mainly a supervised learning guy, you know, so how did I get involved in this unsupervised learning stuff? Well, years ago, I was working on a clustering problem. We were trying to cluster proteins in the protein data bank by their structure. Okay, so not by the DNA sequence, but by the actual chemical structure in 3D of these proteins. And on the left here, I've got a typical large protein, you know, that might be hemoglobin. And we're trying to cluster these proteins by looking at the scaffolding that is used to build large proteins. And it turns out the scaffolding is often these helices, and often pairs of helices. So these are kind of like the girders in a tall building that the protein is built on top of. And you see these structures in the inside of the protein. And I imagine maybe like many of you, if you haven't used clustering yet, I was sort of naive and thought that clustering would be kind of easy, and that I would run it and it would give me useful things, and then I would go on to the next step of the problem. And I guess the rest of the talk is about the adventure when that proved not to be true. So we were trying to do this sort of thing, right? We wanted to do a hierarchical, say, clustering of these proteins by structure. So this is our goal, is something like this. The interesting thing is it took us almost a year to do something that I originally thought would take a month, which was to generate good clusters that were interesting for us. And the question is, why did it take so long to get this simple part of the process working? So this is the main reason why. We would generate a clustering like in that previous figure, and we would take it to our X-ray crystallographer, the guy who was an expert in proteins and structures. And the expert would tell us things like, oh, this protein doesn't really belong here. You should move it over there. Or, these two proteins really shouldn't be in the same cluster. I don't know where they belong, but they shouldn't be together. Or, these two proteins, these are nearly identical. They should be in the same. They're just slight variations of the same thing. They should be together no matter what. They would tell us generic things like, this cluster just sucks. You should definitely fix the clustering so this doesn't happen again. This cluster is really interesting. I hadn't expected to see that. This is surprising. Make sure when you fix the other things about the clustering, this one survives. This cluster is too big, or this one is too small. There aren't really that many of this kind of protein in the data set, so it shouldn't have 100 items. It should have more like 20. Move this cluster, we were doing a hierarchy, move this cluster over nearer to this other cluster because they're similar for the following reason. Anyway, we would get all this sort of feedback. And some of the feedback even included things like, oh, the label for this particular protein is the following. It's a X protein, so it should be clustered with other X proteins. But of course, I haven't told you what the other X proteins are. So that's the kind of process. That's why it took so long. So we would generate a clustering. We would generate some interpretable results from the clustering. We would schedule a meeting. We would get this sort of feedback, over the space of an hour or two. We'd go back, modify our distance metric, modifying our clustering algorithm, modify the data in all sorts of interesting ways to try to satisfy those criteria while maintaining the things that the expert liked. And we would go around this loop sort of every 2 or 3 weeks for almost a year. So what did we learn from this process? So that's what we're going to talk about. Well, one, we did actually finally get there, and we got a sort of nice discovery in protein folding, and this is just a sort of graphical depiction of it. It turns out, we didn't know this in advance, but the most important thing in building the scaffolding of these helices turns out to be the angle at which two adjacent helices touch each other. And the reason why that's important is if you think of them as being two screws with very coarse threads, if they're sitting next to each other and you get the offset just right, they can sit very close to each other because the threads sit into the gap of the adjacent screw. As you start to rotate the clustering, the threads start to bind and interfere, and the helices have to get further apart. Then as you turn more, they slip back in, and they can be tight again. And then as you turn them, they slip out, and they go back in. And it turned out that this helix crossing angle was a critical thing that helped distinguish different proteins. And some proteins intentionally like them far away because that lets the protein do things like what hemoglobin does when it binds or releases oxygen. And other proteins want them to be really rigidly attached because they don't want this part of the protein to bend at all, to give it all. Anyway, so we did actually finally get there. But I want to tell you what we learned about clustering, not what we learned about protein. And I guess the high order bit was that we learned clustering doesn't work the way we thought it did from the textbooks. Right? The textbooks really sort of describe algorithms. You run it on your data set, and the idea is to get the one clustering, the one correct, most compact clustering of your data. That's what the algorithm's trying to do. And a lot of the algorithm's focus is often on doing this very efficiently if your data set is large. So a lot of the focus in the textbooks is just on a single answer and doing it as efficiently as possible. And if it's not working, well, you need a better algorithm. We found that's not the case at all when you go to use clustering. On most data sets, there's no such thing as the right clustering. If I have a data set of people and you're a cardiac physician, the way you would cluster those people is very different from the way a car salesman might cluster exactly that same data. What counts is what you're going to use with the clusters, what you're going to do with them, how you're going to use them. That's what really counts when you do the clustering. And you want different clusterings, even on exactly the same data set for different purposes. So we really decided we needed to change the way we thought about clustering and the way we did it. So we came up with two solutions. In fact, it's one of those cases where once you sort of understand the problem and frame it properly, the solutions sort of pop out at you right away. So within an hour, we had 2 reasonable solutions. One I'm going to describe as sort of user-in-the-loop clustering. This is where the user kind of drives the clustering algorithm in the direction they want it to go. Think of this as an iterative refinement process where the user is looking at the current clustering, giving some feedback somehow to the clustering algorithm. The clustering algorithm makes a change, tries to respond to that. And this is sort of what we were doing with the expert, right? Except that we were the clustering algorithm in the loop. The other process is different. It's sort of user after the loop. And here what we're going to do is we're going to use all those cores that you've got on your computer now. We're going to use this horsepower to generate hundreds of thousands of alternate, hopefully diverse clusterings. All of them are supposed to be pretty good. We don't want to generate random permutations because those are bad. We want to generate many diverse, good clusterings. And then we're going to somehow make it so that the user can look at these clusterings and pick the one that's best for their purposes. So those are the 2 ways we're going to play the game. And I'm just going to breeze through the very first one, and then I'll spend more time on the second one. So the first one works kind of like this. Imagine you have this initial clustering on the left, okay, of your data, and you happen to look at 2 points in the clustering, and you're expert or you decide, I don't think those things should be in the same cluster. This is film photography and that's a digital photography, and I want to separate those things. So somehow you give feedback to the algorithm, and the algorithm does something to then modify the clustering to try to separate points that you've said should be separated, and to try to keep points together that you think should be kept together. And that has an effect not just on the cluster in which those points exist, but it also has an effect on other clusters. So for example, these 2 clusters, which were separate before, have now been merged into one cluster. So that's the kind of process we want to do. And I'm not really going to go into any detail on this. It's actually very simple. We played with some text problems. We used a very simple naive Bayes bags of word model. The distance metric we used was a symmetric form of KL divergence. It's all extremely simple, so I'm just going to skip over it. Also, there are better ways to do this now, so I don't want to sort of ruin you by showing you what looked like a good way to do it back then, but is now not the best way to do it. And our learning, in this case, what we were trying to do is learn a distance metric that kind of satisfied your constraints when you did clustering using this distance metric. And we just did the simplest thing. We put a weight in front of every term, every word that's in the bags of word model, and we would increase or decrease this weight depending on whether we wanted to move things together or separate them. And we had a way of calculating the gradient of the clustering. This is a soft version of clustering, so we have continuity here. We could calculate a gradient with respect to these weights, and then we would just adjust the weight so that the clustering would satisfy more and more whatever constraints you had given it. Okay? And we had different ways of taking a few of these constraints and calculating derivatives for them. So it's a very brief description. Basically, all we're doing is learning a distance function that seems to be most compatible, given the clustering algorithm that you're using, with the constraints that you've already specified. So let me just show you one result from this before I move on to the other form of clustering, which I actually think is more interesting. Here we've got 5 Reuters topics. So we have documents from these 5 topics. And we're just going to add constraints one at a time along the x-axis of this graph. So as we go to the right here, we're adding more and more pairwise constraints. Things like these 2 documents should be in the same cluster, or these 2 documents should not be in the same cluster. And of course, the labels of the documents are hidden from the clustering algorithm. It doesn't know them. Okay, so let me just go through a few things here. So this is accuracy. Because we have labels, we can calculate an accuracy of the clustering. This is kind of a proxy for the utility of the clustering for a particular user, right? So again, we've hidden these labels, and we only use them afterwards to calculate utility. So let's see, these horizontal bars, the lines come in pairs because that's plus or minus 1 standard deviation over a set of experiments. The horizontal bars here that go across the graph, that's just good old unsupervised clustering on the original data, no metric learning at all. And it's not too bad, right? Accuracy is almost 50%, given that we've got 5 topics with equal number from each topic. Baseline would be 20%. So that's reasonable accuracy. It's not too bad. Interesting thing is this very faint pair of lines going up, that's the result of supervised learning. That is, we're actually giving the labels to a learning system, a naive Bayes learning system. And that's the accuracy on the training set, the actual data that it's seeing. So that accuracy sort of climbs by the time you've, this is an easy problem. By the time you put in sort of 50 or 100 labels, you're starting to get an accuracy that's kind of 80 to 90%. On the training set, of course, that's to be expected. These dotted lines down here, that's what's happening with supervised learning on the validation set, on a test set. And you can see that, at some point you're starting to overfit and performance is dropping off. And we're still doing pretty well, though, right? We're still climbing uphill. After about 60 or 70 labels, we're doing sort of 80%-ish. The interesting thing is this one. This is clustering, but clustering where you learn the distance metric based on the constraints that the user has given you. And notice how quickly this jumps up. So on the order of 5 to 10 pairwise constraints, we're managing to get an accuracy that's pretty reasonable here, up to, say, 80% kind of accuracy. Now, don't be too surprised by that, right? Clustering is already, even without any information, is already doing 50%, right? So it's not like supervised learning, which has to start at 20%. So clustering is already sort of doing something reasonable, and all we're doing is taking the reasonable thing it's doing and twisting it until it's better, okay? So that gives you an idea of what can be achieved with this sort of user behind the steering wheel of a clustering algorithm. So that's good. Now, some users want the system to work that way. They have an idea of what they're looking for, but other users don't. Other users don't want to drive, they want to take the bus. Okay. So let's talk about this second mode. I actually think this is the more interesting mode. So this is sort of user after the loop, and my name for this is MetaClustering, but there are other ways of talking about this. Then the game is we're just going to automatically generate many different clusterings. We're going to actually cluster the clusterings. Like, there's no way we can let you look at 100,000 clusterings. Looking at one clustering is painful, so 100,000 is tough. So we're going to cluster the clusterings, and then we're just going to show you a few representative clusterings from this large set of diverse clusterings. And you get to sort of pick the one that's best or home in on a region that you think is working for you. So that's the game we're going to play. So now this is the coastline of Australia and New Zealand. This is, we have a data set where we have descriptions of the bioenvironment in the water. So this is things like turbidity of the water, pH of the water, temperature of the water, oxygen content, things like that. And I'm just showing you 4 different clusterings of that data set. So here's a clustering which happens to put the whole southern coast sort of very, very similar, except for this region. Notice it takes New Zealand, though, and breaks it up into many different clusters. Here's a clustering down here where New Zealand is much more coherent. It's just a few clusters, but we've sort of broken this coast up in different ways. So some of these clusterings, if you look at them, are better at preserving the east and west. They're like better north-south. Others are better. So by north-south, I mean that they tend to make a long filament of cluster that runs north and south, but they don't tend to make a long filament that runs east and west. Others are better at east-west. So an expert might be interested in any one of these for different purposes. Depends on whether you're working on shellfish versus fish versus reef, things like that. So the interesting questions are, well, how do we automatically generate that sort of thing? How do we automatically generate those different diverse clusterings? When we're going to organize these, how are we going to measure the distance between clusterings so that we don't show you a dozen things that are all virtually the same as each other? Then how are we going to organize that after we have a distance metric? And then possibly how are we going to combine multiple clusterings? If it turns out there's a small set that you like, how will we join them into one cluster that summarizes those things? So let's talk about those things, and then we're done. So I've got these data sets. I'm going to show you results for most of these data sets. All of these data sets are things where I basically have labels that I can hold aside. We're going to play the standard trick in evaluating clustering, which is we have labels we hold aside. Clustering doesn't get to see them, and then we measure accuracy of some form on those labels. And that's our proxy for this being useful to some user. One of the data sets is interesting in that we have 2 different labels. So it depends on what your purpose is, whether you're interested in identifying the speaker or identifying the phoneme, which kind of clustering you might want. So let me just jump in and show you some methods and then some results. So we need to generate diverse clusterings. That's step number 1. So how do we do that? Well, think about your good old friend k-means, right, which has a problem that it gets stuck in local minima. So you have to do random restarts and collect many local minima and then find the best one. Well, we can use k-means, and we can just collect all the local minima. So now it's not a case of finding the best. Run it 100,000 times and collect them all. And now we have a set, hopefully, of reasonably compact, reasonable quality clusterings to pick from. Turns out on some problems that's actually effective, but there are problems for which it tends to always end up in sort of the same place. So we're going to make it a little more diverse by playing with the distance function. And in particular, what we're going to do is random weightings on the features in the data. So a very simple thing. We just have linear weight on each independent feature. You can imagine much more interesting things to do than this, but this is all I'm going to talk about now. And so you've got a question, what kind of random weights? Do we want to use uniform random weights? It turns out they're not too bad on some problems, but you've got the following problem. High-dimensional data sets, there's a lot of correlated features. Well, imagine I make 100 copies of feature x1, and then I throw random weights on that 100 copies of feature x1. Well, some will get a low weight, some copies will get a high weight, some will get a medium weight. The average weight on x1 is going to turn out to be, maybe 0.5. So it'll turn out I don't really get any diversity at all. And in high-dimensional data sets, you really have to solve this problem, or else you don't get much diversity from this sort of uniform random weighting. There are multiple ways to do this. One would be to do some sort of PCA, like dimensionality reduction, then do uniform random weighting on that. We used a different method. We used a power law to generate our random weights. We had enough horsepower that this was very effective. And basically, we're going to use the Zipf distribution. And let me just show you the kinds of things that you get. So these are Zipf. If you set the parameter to 0, you get random uniform weights. If you increase the parameter, you get this very spiky distribution, just a few large weights. So let me show you this. There are going to be a couple graphs like this, so I want to explain this to you. This column is cover type. So this is just one of the UC Irvine data sets. And what we have here, every point in this graph is an entire clustering of the data. So every point is a clustering, okay? Along the x-axis, we have the compactness of that clustering measured on the initial feature set without any weights. So this is just a way of me sort of spreading things and talking about compactness. And on the vertical axis, we have accuracy measured using the labels that we've hidden from clustering. So notice that if we use random uniform weights, we get a reasonable cloud, a reasonable diversity of clusters on this problem. As we increase the Zipf parameter, so we go to a spikier weight distribution, notice some interesting things happen. Well, first of all, we get a more diverse cloud of clusterings, so that's a good thing. Notice also that our average compactness on the original default distance metric sort of decreases. To the right here is less compactness. That's more compactness over on the left side. So this is less compact clusterings on average. Really interestingly, notice that we're starting to generate some clusterings that, at least on this problem, are more accurate than the most accurate clusterings on the original distribution. And that continues to happen as we increase the Zipf parameter. Now, it doesn't happen in all data sets. In letter, it turns out the most accurate clusterings are right up here. And in fact, just good old k-means on the original data set, even without random weighting, would do quite well on this particular data set. But some data sets behave like this, some behave like this, some behave in between. We don't know in advance what's good for a data set. So in fact, what we do is we do all of this. We randomly pick a Zipf parameter. We do a random restart with k-means. We collect that clustering, and we do it again. We do it, say, 100,000 times. And if you do that 100,000 times, this is now the union of all of those graphs that we saw in the previous. So it's the union of this plus this plus this. So this is the kind of thing we get. And this is probably the most important slide. If you remember just one slide from the talk, I think this is the one to remember, which is, so these are now the diverse clusterings that we're generating on these 4 different problems. And what I've done down here is I've created a histogram of the accuracy of these things by compactness. So I'm sorry, I've created a histogram by compactness, and then I've identified the point that has the highest accuracy. So the point with the highest accuracy is probably, I don't know, it might be that one right there for cover type, and this one right here for letter. And what's interesting is, so here's the histogram of compactness. The most accurate clustering, according to the labels, doesn't happen until you're 87% of the way into the distribution of the diverse clusterings that we've generated. So at least on this problem, there's a strong mismatch between compactness as measured on the original feature set unweighted and the accuracy or usability of this clustering for a user. So I think this sort of shows you the importance of doing something diverse and then being able to select the one that's most important for your purposes. Now, in other problems, it turns out we don't have to go too far into the distribution, only maybe 20 or 30% into the distribution. With the Australia data set, we have to go about halfway into the distribution. So this is sort of important in that I think it should just convince you that accuracy and compactness on the original features are two surprisingly uncorrelated things. So now this is sort of fun. We've compared a number of different clustering methods here. We've got several variations of hierarchical agglomerative clustering. It turns out it doesn't perform very well. We also tried two of the spectral methods, the method by Ng, Jordan, and Weiss, and Marina Meila's method. So these are two different spectral clustering methods. And if you look for these two markers, you'll see that they do pretty well. Okay, their accuracy up is good in these graphs. Their accuracy is pretty high. If you had to pick a single clustering method, if you couldn't afford to do diverse clustering, as of the time we did this work, spectral clustering clearly looked like the preferable method if you had to pick something. But you can see that in only one case is a spectral method giving us the best answer, and you will do better if you generate diverse clusterings. So it is good to have these techniques that randomize. Now, it turns out we can randomize over the spectral methods as well, and you do to get different things. So again, this is the cover type data set. The red points are what happen if we randomize over the spectral clustering method, and the blue points are what happens if we randomize over the k-means method. So in fact, we do both. So again, we don't know which is better, so we just do both and take the union. So now what are we going to show users? Well, you can't look at 100,000 clusterings, so we're going to cluster the clusterings, and I call that a meta-clustering. And let me just show you this. So this is, say, for the letter data set, we've clustered the clusterings in a hierarchy here. So again, each leaf is itself an entire clustering of the data. And then I've colored the clusterings by the average accuracy for that problem. And you notice that things that are high accuracy, in this case that's the blue, tend to cluster in this hierarchy. So that's a good thing. If that wasn't true, and this was all sort of uniformly monotone, you'd be in trouble, right? It would mean that for your purposes, you couldn't sort of just look in the neighborhood. But here you could imagine like looking at a clustering here, saying, oh, that doesn't look good, jumping to the other side and saying, oh, that looks good, and then sort of looking around that neighborhood quickly. So that's the game you'd want to play. Let me just skip that. And then one thing you can do is you can do some sort of consensus clustering. So the big green things are consensus clustering over all the clusterings we generated. That's pretty good, but it turns out spectral clustering is often better than a consensus clustering over all the clusterings. Here's the cool thing. Because we've clustered the clusterings, we can do a consensus clustering of each large cluster of clusterings, and it turns out that's often very good. So these are the points that we suggest to show to users, which is a very small number of points that are themselves representative of their whole region of clustering. And then a user could, if they wanted to, drill down further if they found this point interesting. Okay, so that's it. Take-home message, there are lots of ways to cluster any complex data set. One way or another, you're going to have to use side information. You're going to have to put the human in the loop. Maybe you're going to do this by generating diverse clusterings, then organizing those clusterings and selecting. I personally prefer this method now, and the reason why is if you're driving, you tend to end up where you expect it to go, whereas if you do the diverse clustering, you still have the chance of being surprised with things that you hadn't expected to see. And just so you know, in rare cases, there is actually a unique clustering answer you're trying to achieve, like in phylogenetic trees. But that's very rare in modern data sets. So, thank you.
Thank you. We have time for some questions, but in the meantime, Marina can start setting up over here. Marina?
And just so you know, in the slides, I've got a few references if you want. And there are workshops now on this sort of thing if you're interested in that. But I'm happy to take questions. Oh, it's a good question, and I didn't mention it. We actually do vary the number k in k-means from everything that looks reasonable for the data. We do a little bit of preliminary processing to sort of find the sweet spot that looks interesting. Basically, k not too large. And then we actually randomly pick a k in addition to a Zipf parameter every time we do a restart of k-means. So I'm glad you asked that.
Another question over here. Sorry.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. The question is, were any of the data sets unbalanced? And a couple of the data sets are. And some of the data sets are multiple classes, like the cover type data set, where we got very interesting results. The major class is fairly big, but the smaller classes are actually relatively rare compared to the major class. Yeah, good question.
You randomize only coefficients in different lower power output. I mean, you use only N2 is different coefficients, or N1 and 2.
Regularization.
We only did, first of all, it's just linear terms on each term, linear weights on each term, and it's just L2. Yeah. Yeah. Varying the regularization, though, would have been very interesting. Yes.
Rich, I like the idea of selecting a subset of clusters in the end, but how would you imagine a user would use that? Because they're still very different, and they clusters in different ways, and clusters might have different labels.
Right. So if you have already something akin to labels or pairwise preferences, then there's a good chance, I mean, you can still do selection afterwards. You can generate all the clusters and then find the ones that satisfy most of your pairwise preferences, or most of your labels are conserved by the clusters. But I think it's more likely that a user doesn't really know what they're going to do, and there's maybe a whole other learning system that's downstream of the clusterings. And in that case, what I would do is I would take those consensus clusterings, say the dozen different consensus clusterings, and I would run the downstream system on each of them and see which one yields the best answer from the downstream system. And that's something we've done where we were using clustering as a way of starting active learning. And it turned out that some clusterings were great initial starts for active learning and others were not. So, yeah.
Let's thank the speaker again.
Okay, thank you.
For the next speaker, we have our first UW speaker, Marina Meila. After her time at MIT, she tag teamed, I think, with Rich at CMU, and then came to UW. And over the last several years, she's done work in a variety of areas in machine learning and statistics, from clustering, the work that was described previously, through representing permutations and dimensionality reduction techniques.
So I started this as a continuation of spectral clustering, and all I want to say is that back when I was doing spectral clustering, and some of you may know that manifold learning and spectral clustering share a lot of the infrastructure and pre-processing of the data. I was saying, you guys in manifold learning have it easy. I project the data to a low-dimensional space, and then I have to actually do the clustering and solve the combinatorial problem, whereas you guys just make a pretty picture, and you're done. But now that I'm working in manifold learning, I changed my mind. There is a lot of interesting work to do after the pretty picture. Where would we use manifold learning? There are many, many data sets that are very high dimensional, and here I'm showing one of them, a set of images that are 4,000 pixels each, approximately. But we have reasons to believe that, in fact, these very high dimensional data are governed, or their variation is governed by a small number of parameters. For instance, all these images can be parameterized by some very simple parameters like head rotation or illumination. So, in fact, what we have here is a three-dimensional data set hidden in a very high dimensional space. And that is a manifold, and I will be as little mathematical as possible, and I'm going to repeat all the mathematical terms often enough that at least you recognize them. A manifold learning algorithm is an algorithm that reduces the dimension and aims to find this parametrization in a nonlinear fashion. It takes as input the data in high dimensions and outputs something low dimensional for every point, a set of coordinates that I denote by phi of p, which are the new coordinates of the point once we have moved it in low dimensions. The idea is that we want to do this with very little loss in information, so that we can process. So this is the unsupervised framework, at least for most of the talk, where we can process the embedded data or the reduced dimensional data as if it was the high dimensional and preserve the information in it. And of course, you are already thinking what kind of information I want to preserve. For instance, it looks like this embedding has preserved the rotation and the two rotations of the head. However, Rich here, if he wants to do manifold learning, he uses another algorithm and obtains these coordinates. And other people, like this algorithm, obtain these coordinates. Of course, there have been many algorithms published. Each of them will produce a new embedding or a different embedding. So the question is, how do we distinguish between them? What is good and what is bad between them? Are they all good? Or are some better than others in some sense? I must say that in the past, there have been an embarrassing trend to compare embedding algorithms by pictures, so visually. And that happens in clustering as well. It's coming from the difficulty of unsupervised learning or of having formal criteria for estimating quality. That's our curves. So let's look at this very commonly used dataset, artificial dataset, which is the Swiss roll. It's a sheet, it's a rectangular density rolled up, and it has a hole so that the density is not convex. Makes things a little complicated. I embedded it. In fact, I have used software available on the web to embed it in by various algorithms, and I get different results. And if you have any experience with these kind of algorithms and with embedding in general, you will notice, you'll know what mistakes each of them makes, if you can call it a mistake. Or you'd notice, if you are a user actually of the data, you can consider whether this is a mistake for you or not. But it remains that there is great variety, and it's not easy to say whether this is a mistake or not. For instance, between these two algorithms, are they really different? Do they do really different things or not? Of course, we'd like to see something more like the rectangle on the right, because we know that that's what we did before. But even this one is stretched strongly, because in fact it should be a very long rectangle and not a rectangular one. So we have many algorithms. I shouldn't say current paradigm in all the field, but as I said, there is a strong tendency to compare algorithms on pictures, and this is misleading. What we want is to ask more precise and scientific questions, like how do we define what is good? What do we want from the algorithm? One thing that is noticed is that distances or other geometric values of the data in high dimensions are distorted when we go to low dimensions. This is a problem for many applications where you have a spatial process. And we'd like in particular to guarantee or to know that we don't lose this geometric information. But we would also like to compare embeddings done by different algorithms. We'd like to know what is it that how would we map one to the other, for instance. So this is a way of making it better by just putting in the same frame, the same coordinate. In fact, if we take two data sets from the same distribution and embed them by the same algorithm, we would get coordinates, but it is not known, and in fact, it is not true for most algorithms that we can actually take the union of those coordinates and have the embedding of the union of the data by using the parts. Because the coordinates are incompatible. Each mapping is generated by an algorithm in absence of other references. And we like to put this reference framework back. And then there are more specific problems, like what is the intrinsic dimension? What is the number of parameters that varies? That is the true dimensionality of the data. And another even more technical question, but an important question, with every embedding algorithm, with every manifold, there is a scale at which this relationship holds, this linearity holds. If we look at a very high scale, we only see a little blob. The all data is a blob. If we look at a smaller scale, we see noise. What is the scale where we see something meaningful for us and our problem? And this scale is not unique, but some scales are interesting and some are not. Now, I'll talk first about the distortion problem, and then I'll briefly return to the others. So, can we find an algorithm that gets rid of the distortions? Likely no, because here is, I don't know if you can read yes, you could. Yeah. So, even on the very simplest problems where I don't reduce the dimension at all, I take something one-dimensional and I obtain something one-dimensional in 2 dimensions, distortion appears. And in fact, if you, anybody who has actually studied the problem mathematically will know that for the distortion is generic. There are only very lucky cases where there are certain symmetries in the data that allow us to use a nonlinear embedding algorithm without a distortion of the distances. However, there is something that we can refine this argument and say what we can do is find the neighborhood. So between the red embedding, which we call wrong because it's distorted, and the blue embedding, which is the truth, there is a difference in distances, and they observe it as a stretch, but there is a similarity locally because points that are neighbors in the blue are neighbors in the red. That means that the algorithm preserves the topology, but loses the geometry. I want to also say that this is not a consistency proofs don't solve this. This is a property of the algorithm, and it's not a property of having a problem of having too little data. If you had infinite data and apply the algorithm to the infinite manifold, we'd still see the same problem. So we deal with 2 different problems in manifold learning. One is preserving the topology, and condition on that is preserving the geometry. And when I say preserving the geometry, I mean distances, but not only distances. The technical word for this is isometry. So here is on the right, we have something, an embedding that's something that we would like, that preserves the geometry and the topology underlying it. And here we only preserve the topology, but there is a stretch, a smooth stretch in the manifold that changes the geometry. Now, there has been work into devising algorithms that take directly the data and obtain this picture. I know of this, but this work is very preliminary, and it is not even sure that it could be of practical value. So until then, what I and my collaborator proposed is to take the existing algorithms, which exploit the fact that topology is correct and obtain embeddings that are stretched but otherwise correct, and correct them by estimating the distortion that is made and add it to the algorithm. So that our algorithm, instead of returning just the coordinates phi, will return also g, the geometry. And I'll define in the next slides what the geometry is. Again, the next technical term is the geometry is defined by Riemannian metric. And to see what the Riemannian metric is, you can skip to the blue part, which says that if I have an embedding, every data point has coordinates. To each set of coordinates in some coordinate system, I attach a little symmetric, positive definite symmetric matrix of a dimension equal to the intrinsic dimension of the data. So if the intrinsic dimension of the data is small, this augmentation of my embedding is not so large. Also, we are going to work with positive definite matrices, so we have some hope that these estimations will be stable numerically, that will actually be usable, which is not true of all possible embedding algorithms that try to fit the metric in other ways. This slide just shows that G is involved in all the geometric measures. For instance, it gives us the angle between 2 vectors. It gives the line element if we integrate along a line. It gives us the volume element if we want to integrate on the surface. So basically, because a manifold is a stretched patch of a Euclidean space, when we integrate on it, we have to apply the change of variable formula, and we have a volume element that varies spatially. That is exactly G, or is determinant. To formalize what we are doing, given some data set, given some embedding algorithm, and you pick your own favorite embedding algorithm, after the embedding is done, we are going to estimate the metric at each point, which will be how much was the data distorted at that point. This is possible because the Riemannian metric is also involved with another quantity besides all the other geometric quantities called the Laplace-Beltrami operator in differential geometry and the graph Laplacian when you look at graphs. And this luckily has been studied very intensely for various reasons in the past years. So we know a lot about the graph Laplacian, its properties, and how to estimate it. So all we have to do is invert proposition 1, which is what we did. Proposition 1 is a standard fact in differential geometry. What we did is not technically hard, but it's useful. This theorem says that H, which is the matrix inverse, so the elements of the inverse of that small matrix, D by D, are obtained by applying the Laplacian to the product of the coordinates I and J centered at the point. Yeah, like here. And as a bonus, we know how to estimate the graph Laplacian well so that we can have hopefully numerically stable computations, which we do. So this is the algorithm that produces both an embedding and a metric. The first step is common to every embedding algorithm. We pre-process the data, and I will say a little more about it later. The third step is also common to all algorithms, is the embedding itself. The middle step happens in some algorithms. It's the estimation of the graph Laplacian. And the last step is just applying the formula that you saw to estimate the graph Laplacian in the coordinates. And then we output for every point the coordinate and the distortion. This is not for you to read, just to show that the whole algorithm fits in one page. And if I had, if I had taken the comments out, it would be a few lines of MATLAB code. Now, if we apply it to a manifold for which we actually know what the data is, what it will produce is at every point a little ellipse. The ellipse is my way of showing the axis of this positive definite matrix. I have embedded in 3 dimensions, so these ellipses should be ellipsoids, but nicely enough, because the intrinsic dimension is D, the matrix knows that one of the eigenvalues is very small, so they are flat ellipsoids, what you're seeing here, even though they look like ellipses. And to read this, one can notice that there are circles here where the deformation is not large, but they start to be elongated where the embedding has squashed the dumbbell, which means that when I'm going along this edge, I have to dilate the distances that I measure on the graph to get the correct distance on the original manifold. By the way, are there questions at this point? This is a good slide to remember. Then, now that we can estimate the distortion and the metric, and we have manifolds together with metric. What can we do? We can look again at the sculpture faces and say, well, this is just the same as isomap, but if I actually integrate with these little ellipses that tell me exactly how the distortion has happened and where. So now I have 3 embeddings that are equivalent, because it doesn't matter what I see, it matters that I can, when I actually want to measure something on the manifold, I have the right mathematics and the right algorithm to compute those quantities correctly, because I have the line element and the volume element. The simplest thing to do is to rectify the visualization. For manifolds that are not flat, this one is, but for manifolds that are not flat, one cannot actually show them undistorted on a page of paper, or visualize them undistorted. So what we can do, the best we can do is to pick a point and normalize and flatten them around the point. So this shows the neighborhood of this red point that's very hard to see in the original embedding and after you transform the data with basically the inverse of that matrix. Second, this shows simply that we can preserve distances. This is a hemisphere, a path on the hemisphere, 2 embeddings that distort the data, both of them. And this is the value of the shortest path measured and computed correctly using the metric. As you can see, we get the same value no matter whether we use isomap or other algorithms. And it's very close to the true distance, about 3%. This slide shows that this is robust to noise, because we do not have any proof that this works in noise, but we have empirical evidence that's known that manifold learning can tolerate and actually smooth is a method of smoothing low noise from a manifold. The same can be done with area, and notice that Laplacian Eigenmaps, which has no guarantees, and it's actually terrible at preserving any distances without using the metric, is by far the most accurate when we use the correct metric. Now one can use the metric for more than just calculations of the manifold. As I said, there is a problem of choosing the scale. To have the correct embedding, we have to have a good scale, because otherwise we miss the topology too. And this is a known problem for which, so the scale is this epsilon that is used in the Gaussian kernel to construct the similarity matrix from which everything starts, or the graph. What is known is only asymptotic. In reality, people use cross-validation, but for cross-validation, you need to have a supervised problem, like a regression on a manifold or a classification problem. People use visual inspection, and there are some heuristics, but they depend on the embedding, and we have compared them. Our idea is as follows. Well, let's pick the epsilon that gives us the best geometry. But how do we know that we have the best, or the least distortion? But to what do we compare the least distortion? Well, there is something simple to compare. It's the same idea as in autoencoders. When you don't have a target to compare to, you compare to the identity, to yourself. So essentially, in high dimensions, the metric we know is the identity. The distances are what they are in high dimensions. So essentially, we construct the Laplacian, we compute the metric, and see if for the embedding, the trivial embedding, it matches to the identity. And we average this over all data. So this is G epsilon that depends on the particular epsilon we used. We compare with the identity. This Frobenius norm is the correct norm to compare. And then we average over the manifold, and we choose the one epsilon that gives us the best, the lowest distortion. It's not going to be zero. Let's see how it works. This is an unsupervised method. It's done before even using an embedding. We just find what is the scale at which the data is best, the manifold geometry is best preserved, without even specifying a problem. So now I'm going to specify some problems. First of all, as I said, it is known that if I have a manifold plus noise, the manifold embedding smooths the data and recovers the manifold pretty well. Well, does this hold? So I took artificial data. I couldn't do this on real data. I took a manifold without noise, embedded it. I took a manifold with noise, embedded it too, used various scales, and then compared. What is the epsilon at which I get best smoothing? The colored curves, okay, so the colored curves are the amount of difference between the noisy manifold embedding and the non-noisy manifold embedding. And you see that it depends on the scale I use, because at lower scale, I start modeling the noise. They are more sensitive to noise, as it is obvious. And the vertical bars are the choice of epsilon, which doesn't know anything about what I'm doing. However, it fits, if not perfectly, very closely to the range of scales that are interesting for the problem and correct, that smooth the data. Okay, so I have 5 more minutes for various applications. Another application or another question is, well, how many dimensions should I embed in? What is the intrinsic dimension? They're not the same question, though. For instance, a sphere has intrinsic dimension 2, but I prefer to embed it in slightly more dimensions, 3, because then I don't have to break it into patches. And this is an ongoing area of research in manifold. Well, one of the methods that is used is to actually do local SVD and look at the eigengaps and separate the eigenvalues that depend on the geometry from the eigenvalues that depend on the noise and curvature. The authors have a pretty complicated method of choosing epsilon, so we apply the scale, because this only happens at some scales. So we choose our method, which is more straightforward. And in fact, there are some numerical reasons you can ask me later why it's much easier to optimize. And these are the results. The gray is the true area, so we want to hit the gray area always, because that's where the eigengaps give me the true dimension. Again, this is on artificial data with noise. The blue and black are 2 versions of our method with standard deviations. On the vertical axis is epsilon. So we want to be on each plot on the vertical axis inside the gray rectangles. And then there are the white rectangles are there from the other method. So as you can see, we always hit we always hit the gray rectangle, so our result is always correct, whereas the rectangles obtained from the other method have some areas where they overlap and some areas where they don't. So one may go wrong with them. Finally, we did something more complex that will be only shown in about 2 pictures, and that is one can define a Gaussian process on a manifold via the graph Laplacian. And so we can look at spatial processes and on the manifold using actually the spatial relations intrinsic in the geometry of the manifold, and use them for regression or classification. And this is a way of doing semi-supervised learning. So we use this method on the benchmark data sets of Chappelle et al., where the data is all in 240 dimensions, and there are about 1,000 data points, out of which 100 are labeled. And we use 50, this is the standard, the benchmark is to use 50 for training and 50 for testing. We compare with cross-validation with the other heuristic that is embedding dependent and with our method. In fact, for our method, we don't even need to do an embedding. We just use the metric in the graph Laplacian. And we succeed on all but one task. I want to say that the last 2 tasks are interesting because they are not manifolds. These are Gaussian data. The others are Gaussian. And the task where we fail is the only task where it's known that the data is a mixture of 2 scales. 2 minutes. Yeah. But what is interesting to point out, and because I'm almost done, I'll linger and point this out here, is that CV is in supervised mode. So CV sees the labels and chooses the scale by seeing the labels, whereas our algorithm doesn't see the labels ever. So it's working in unsupervised mode, which means that it must be finding something that's important in the data. And another thing is it's confirming the general feeling that understanding the data geometry and unsupervised understanding of the data does help in supervised tasks, especially when the labels are few. Okay, the same is done for a regression problem with the same Gaussian process. Notice that if we map the data to an embedding and do regression in Euclidean space, we get distortion about 3,000. But if we do it with the Gaussian process, we get a distortion that's about 5 times smaller. Now, just to rephrase what we did, we took existing manifold learning algorithms and added information that preserves the geometry, basically compensates for the distortion in geometry that a manifold algorithm will naturally do. This way, we can do all the geometric operation we would do on the original data in the embedded space with losses due to noise mainly. We can also now compare the algorithms because we have a way of transforming their inputs from one coordinate system into the other via the metric. And then this is, yes, I have demonstrated that this is just the beginning. We can use this information for many, many purposes. Thank you very much.
Questions here?
Yeah. So the answer will be in your one slide, pseudocode, right?
Yes.
I just want to know how scalable is that technique to the number of the sample size and also to the dimensionality of your data?
Okay, so I was expecting this question. I run my algorithm on between 1 and 10,000 data points on one machine and simply. There are multi-scale methods for eigenvalue. So this method is performing an eigenvalue decomposition. So what is expensive? Is the eigenvalue decomposition, computing the eigenvectors. And actually, almost any manifold learning algorithm does that, even without mine. So and that is a problem for all manifold learning algorithms. So I'm going to respond on behalf of all manifold learning. And then there's the computing the distances and neighborhoods at the beginning. I consider this a solved problem, at least up to some scale, because this is already, a lot has been done in that area. What I want to say about the second part. Manifolds are described as objects whose patches are like Euclidean space. So if you take all your million data points and make it Laplacian, that's going to be pretty expensive and slow to compute. But you don't need to do that. You need to get a region around the point, a large region, yes? But you don't need to put all your data because manifolds are local, and the information in the Laplacian is local, and the information in all the embedding algorithms will be actually local to a scale that's larger than the scale of my neighborhood. So it's not epsilon, but an R, yes? And so I don't know if anybody has done it today, but I don't see any reason this shouldn't scale to any scale that can.
So all these detailed pattern aspects.
They can. No, they're not on that slide. No. That is what I implemented.
John?
There's nothing in your metric that requires me to
No.
So I have a prediction. I think you could try to PCA on real data.
Yes, actually it's a good. Yes, okay. So the question was whether there is something that prevents the method from being linear, and in particular the embedding to be PCA. And the answer is no. There is nothing in particular, and that one can do this too. There is something that we need to do. We need to know that we preserve topology. Yes, that the neighborhoods are preserved. So yes. So I need to have a subspace that's large enough or not flattening. So with data that actually is in a subspace, an affine space, it should work.
Yeah, so I think that happens with PCA. I don't think you need Swiss roll is very different. Most data is not like Swiss.
Yes, most data is not like Swiss roll. But I think most data is also not like a subspace. Yes, so the remark was that as long as it's a one-to-one mapping from one space to the other, it works. I'm thinking of periodical movements or so on where things work around. But again, we can talk about it. I'll be happy to. Yes?
So for your last example, where you presented learning in conjunction with Gaussian process regression, are you guys taking into account like the constraints that come from the regression part when you do the manifold question?
Yes. Oh, okay, so maybe I didn't understand the question. So the question was about Gaussian process regression, and what I understood is whether we actually take the output into account when we actually do the manifold learning part. No, we construct so the covariance matrix that appears in Gaussian process regression is constructed from our geometric knowledge of the kernel and the Riemannian metric. And then we look at the output. After we construct that and we use all the manifold learning in constructing the kernel, then we look at what points are observed and what points are queried. Yes, we do. And in fact, this is an interesting area of work. There is no, so unsupervised learning wants to preserve all in the data because we don't know what to do with the data, what the user want to do. But if we want to do something supervised, it's the same as with support vector machines. We don't want to preserve the geometry of the data. We want to distort it to our benefit. We want to increase the margin. And manifold learning methods and Riemannian geometry should work there as well. In fact, I had an office mate who 10 years ago was thinking of using Riemannian metric to do quite that. So maybe now it's at the time to try to do that again.
So question here. How do you imagine people use this method when you have the extra local geometry? Because with manifold learning, you try to think about data exploration type problems. So what's your thought here?
Yeah, so the question is, how will people use now the data better and manifold learning better because they have the G? I'm thinking that now we can use manifold learning without looking at the data because, in fact, this doesn't help us see the data better. But it helps us compute things on the data without seeing it, so pipelining it to something else. And in particular, I'm thinking of physical systems, a complex system where we know that physical systems, motion and other things, where an expert may know or may guess that there is a small number of parameters as opposed to the raw representation of the data, but where we don't know what these parameters are. So I see it as a discovery of the parameters, the natural coordinates of a physical system.
In some data sets, the dimensionality changes with the scale of the distribution. And I'm curious what kind of dimensionality would it be the highest dimensionality that occurs at any scale, or do you have to define the scale?
So the question was, sometimes the dimensionality changes with the scale, and in fact I had some slides that I didn't show about that. Yes, it is true, if I have a very small scale, I only see noise, and I'm going to see a large dimension, and then as I increase the scale, I can see things at different dimensions. That is true. What we have now, the geometry and the self-consistency that we apply for finding the interesting scales should work in that case. There is information in the in G, in the matrix, there is information in the eigenvalues. So I didn't say this, but if we embed in 10 dimensions and we have only 2 dimensions, the manifold has intrinsic dimension 2, then the rank of the matrix is 2. And of course, the rank is noisy as everything else, but we can start from there and finding what are at. So at different scales, the rank changes, and you can see that.
Thank you very much. So we're going to do a linear projection of the break into 20 minutes and reconvene at 11:30.